What's up guys, Dom here, one half of Death by Confetti. For those of you who don't know, I do a lot of photography outside of this YouTube thing. So in today's video, I wanted to go over some camera basics because I have a few video ideas on different camera tutorials and photography tutorials that I want to put out, but I wanted to go over these basics first just so we can be on the same page. So today we're going to be talking about ISO, shutter speed, and aperture right after the intro. So first up, we're going to talk about aperture. Aperture is essentially telling your lens how much of an opening there is and how much light is going into the lens, thus into the camera. This is going to have two different effects. Basically, how much light is coming in is going to dictate how bright your image is or how dark your image is. And it's also going to dictate how much separation there is between the subject and the background. And that's what's going to create a blurry background or not. So I'm going to go through two different aperture settings and kind of tell you guys the differences between the two. So aperture is calculated in f-stop. So it's that f-1.4 or f-22 or anything in between. That's your aperture. So in this example, I'm going to compare f-stop 1.4 and f-stop 22. So f-stop 1.4 is considered a high aperture because the opening is going to be a lot wider, letting more light in, which is going to cause two things. It's going to make your image a lot brighter. It's also going to separate the subject from the background a lot more, which is going to create a blurry background. So I'm shooting at 1.4 right now, so you can see anything in the back here is super blurry in contrast to me. If we compare that with f-stop 22, at 22, it's going to be a lot darker, so you're going to have to use the two other settings that we're going to talk about to make your image brighter. And it's also going to create less separation from the background, meaning that most likely nothing in your image is going to be blurry. So this is particularly useful when you're shooting a landscape and you want everything to be super sharp in the image. You don't want any background blur at all. This is a bit confusing to understand at first because of the low number, high aperture, high number, low aperture. But trust me, once you fiddle around with the settings a bit, you're gonna quickly understand how these work. Next up is shutter speed. So when we're talking shutter speed, we're talking about how much time that shutter is being left open when taking an image before closing back up. So it's essentially how much time it's taking to take that picture. That's going to have two very distinct effects. The first being how much light is coming into the camera and also how much motion blur is going on. So you can start to see how shutter speed is acting similarly to aperture in the fact that it's also dictating how much light is coming into the camera, but the second effect it has is completely different. So yes, we're talking about blur again, but it's a different type of blur. When talking about aperture, we're talking about a background blur. Here we're talking a motion blur. So if the shutter is open for 5 seconds, let's say, and there are things moving in the image during that 5 seconds, you're gonna be able to see that movement in the image. Whereas if you have a higher shutter speed, everything is going to be a lot sharper and there's going to be less motion blur in the image. You might still have some background blur because of the aperture, but it's not going to be motion blur. A very classic example of using a long shutter speed would be having your camera out and having your shutter set to 30 seconds, let's say, while cars are passing by at night. So that's going to create one of those images where you see the light trails from the cars passing by, but you don't actually see the cars because it was taking an image for 30 seconds. So you can start to see how using these settings for different scenarios can create some different artistic effects. And lastly, we're going to talk about ISO. So ISO is pretty straightforward compared to the two other settings. It's basically artificial or fake light that your camera is adding to the image. So this is going to make your image brighter or darker depending on how much ISO you add to your image. So once you've dialed in your aperture and your shutter speed and you're satisfied with the look that you're going for, ISO is going to be the setting that you change to make the image bright enough if it's too dark. Now keep in mind that because this is fake light, the more you're going to add to your image, the more grain you're going to start introducing to your photos. Different cameras are going to be better or worse with ISO and are going to introduce more or less grain. That's just something you have to figure out with your own gear, but that's the gist of it. This is a fairly brief explanation of the 3 settings, but the more you're going to experiment with these things, the more you're going to understand how these relate to each other and how you can use some of these settings for different looks. At the end of the day, it's really the 3 settings combined together that are going to make an image what it is. I hope you learned something in this video. If you're new here, please consider subscribing. I'm going to have more tutorials like this, as well as our travel videos and lifestyle vlogs. And while you're here, if you want to give this video a big old thumbs up and leave me a comment down below if you have any questions at all, I'll make sure to reply as soon as I can. With that being said, thank you guys so much for watching. Till next time, peace.